Welcome to today's Democracy Talk. The Rooney Center for American Democracy puts on Democracy Talks twice per semester, inviting Notre Dame scholars and guest experts presenting many lessons on key concepts and issues in American democracy. Our goal is to help the ND community be better informed and to feel empowered to take ownership of our own democracy. Today's guest lecture will be presented by Professor Bill Donahue. Professor Donahue serves many roles on this campus. He is the John J. Cavanaugh C.S.C. Professor of the Humanities, the Director of the Initiative for Global Europe at the Keough School of Global Affairs, the Professor of German and a concurrent Professor of Film, Television, and Theater at the College of Arts and Letters, and a Professor of European Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs, to name a few. His recent scholarship has been on contemporary European studies, with a focus on Germany, including German literature and film and Holocaust studies. His presentation today, titled The Student Becomes a Teacher, explains lessons on American democracy that we can learn from Germany during a pivotal time in our own history. Professor Donahue will first give his lecture for about 30 minutes, and then he and I are going to engage in a moderated discussion of about 10 to 15 minutes, and then the remainder of the time will be available for you all to ask him questions. So thank you all very much for being here today, and let's give it up for Professor Donahue.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out, especially when there's a very interesting lecture right next door. Appreciate you being here this afternoon. I'm going to try kind of a new way of speaking, and I can see my slides this way. So let's just jump right in with an apology. It's a typical thing for an academic to change his title or apologize for it. I think I should have been more humble and put a question mark. Student becomes the teacher, because as you'll see in a few moments, Germany doesn't want to be our teacher at all. But nevertheless, we may want to consider it our teacher, and let's see how that plays out. Well, in case I have to wake it up, there we go. First of all, Benjamin, thank you for the introduction. You said some very nice things about me, but I should say what I am not. I am not a political scientist, and I've come to this topic kind of out of interest. Over the years, I've been a Germany observer for about 40 years, starting when I was probably younger than some of you guys. And at some point I thought, I would like to say something about this. And Commonweal picked up a kind of a regular column, I would say, or irregular column about called Letter from Germany. And I was surprised myself when I was preparing this talk, how many of my contributions actually have to do with German democracy. I've just listed a couple of them there. It's not so important that you look at them, but looking back at them, I was reminded that this has been a longer standing interest than I myself realized. And I assume, Claudia, that's why you asked me to speak based upon this. So I think that democracy is something absolutely for the experts, but we can't let the experts own it entirely. It's too important that just elites are concerned. We all need to be concerned. And so I'm coming from that larger group. So I've reflected a little bit on myself, what I am and what I'm not. I want us now to reflect on ourselves, where we come from, because I think it's impossible to seriously consider the importance of improving American democracy if you don't think we need to. So let's look at this. So, sorry, it's a little dated. I'm a little loud here, a little vulgar possibly, and maybe other interesting things, but I do think it's an important gateway consideration. If we have so much arrogance that we think we don't need to be any better, you don't need to stay. We don't need to consider this, right? But maybe we do need to do better, right? And my contention is that Germany offers us some ideas, some possibilities, in a way that might be surprising. I have another quote up here about American exceptionalism. I thought our colleague Tobias might be here. I took it from his book. He's quoting Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann, one of the greatest German emigres, came during the Nazi period in 1938. And what he said at the top, we won't look at the whole quote. At the top, he says, speaking to his American audience, America needs no instruction in the things that concern democracy. Now, he's ingratiating himself. He's being polite. He's flattering a bit. But it's 1938. So a student as smart as Jacob Scherer is going to say, wait a second, what's going on in American democracy in 1938? What's not going on in democracy in America in 1938? Who's not voting in the American South, the Jim Crow South, et cetera? Thomas Mann was being way too nice, right, even then. American exceptionalism is a roadblock to our learning, right? So if we have to see if we can get beyond that. And that's, I guess, one of the first challenges for today. I also want to say, by way of beginning the presentation, I'm not the first to suggest that Germany has a lot to offer us. One of my heroes, Susan Neiman, who will be coming to Notre Dame on April 2nd to the 4th, so come back out and see her, wrote a very important book in 2019 called Learning from the Germans. It's focused more on so-called memory culture and facing the Nazi past, but it isn't related in an important and substantive way to democracy, as I'll try to connect with when I speak at the end of today's presentation. Another book that I think has been overlooked, possibly because the cover makes it look trivial. It's not. It's written by the reporter John Kampfner, who wrote, as some of you may remember, for The Telegraph from Great Britain for years. He was actually assigned to East Germany, so that shows you not only his age, but his experience. He's got a lot to say as well. And he's, I guess, in that column of expert amateurs or amateur experts who's actually lived this experience. Now, the third caveat before we get started with the various ways in which Germany might inspire us to do somewhat better is to say that Germany doesn't want to do this. Right? No self-respecting German, Kampfner says, he interviewed people for an entire year and couldn't find anybody who would say, yes, as a German, you should follow the way we do things. Neiman comes to a similar conclusion when she says, it's almost part of any self-respecting German's identity of belonging to a country that is properly remembering its past to say that we're not doing it good enough, that it's insufficient, that to have this kind of ingrained, required, enforced humility. So if you're thinking that you're going to find a confident German to give this talk, no, not very likely. But anyway, I'll do it in their spot instead. Let's give it a shot. So what I'm calling it now is an academic fantasy. Fantasy for a couple of reasons. One, I want us to set aside objections you might have in your mind, such as, wait a second, this is politically impracticable. Why would a country such as the United States, no matter how in need we might be of improvement in democracy, turn to Germany? It's all kinds of political issues there that are worth thinking about. You could dismiss it for reasons of history, right? Good reasons. You say we didn't have the history that Germany had, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment as well. But let's suspend that disbelief for a moment and just see if the ideas themselves, the practices themselves could be interesting and at least from a point of view of their desirability, be something you want to consider for transfer. And now a confession. It's not quite plagiarism, but I have stolen the points from a real political scientist, Stephen Jabot, who wrote for the Foreign Policy. I took his points, I changed them, I edited them, I've played around with them, but I've given you the source there. I want to run through some of the things he says with some of my commentary, if I may. So the first thing, and it's huge, and I don't have a whole lot of eloquence on this, but it's huge, and that is Germany has gotten, to a large extent, money out of politics. You may raise your eyebrows because if you're old enough to remember Kohl, you remember he went down because he did take money illegally. Yes, they have their scandals. Yes, there are problems there too. It's not a perfect country, and I want to stress that also. But Kohl went down because it was illegal. In the United States, the Supreme Court said in 2010 in their big decision, the Citizens United decision, that you can virtually have unlimited contributions from corporations and individuals. It is a huge difference, and it changes the entire democratic landscape. The German election season is much shorter. You don't get your television interrupted as much, if on a very practical level. If we have time and interest, I'd like to come back to this because there may be a Notre Dame connection if we want to, in our discussion, actually talk about what we can do here. Number two, I will be brief about this as well, because of course we're not going to seriously, in the short run at least, consider transforming the House of Representatives into a parliament, right? That's just not going to happen. But the essential principle, I think, is worth thinking about, and that is proportional representation does lead to higher voter turnout and participation. We know that, right? I've cribbed this from people who do know this and have done serious studies on this. One thing, though, that we can focus on, and I've highlighted that in yellow, is to see the way in which the Germans don't do something we do. They've obviated the Electoral College by turning the Bundestag into the entity that elects the chief executive, the chancellor. So without the Electoral College, which is designed to distort the popular vote and has distorted it at least 5 times in our history, right? Germans will never run into the problem that we have where you might feel your vote doesn't matter. In the United States, if you're not in a swing state, you might with good reason think, why bother? Why should I vote? If it's not, it's already clear that Ohio is going to go red and that California is going to go blue. So why bother? That doesn't happen in Germany. It is structurally impossible because of the election precincts are set up that everyone has not only 1 vote, but 2 votes. And that's not in the corrupt sense of Chicago politics about voting often. It's actually a very refined sense of voting directly for a candidate and then also for a party. And that keeps the party strong. And that's going to be my next slide, actually. But I think I've said enough for this one because I'm conscious that we have to move on a bit. Party discipline is greater in Germany. I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that some of the shenanigans that we've experienced in this country recently, with Kevin McCarthy being deposed by one individual, Gates from Florida. You can fill in other examples from your mind, from the news. Marjorie Taylor Greene has done all kinds of things. This kind of shenanigans would be impossible in Germany because of party discipline, or less likely at least, right? Now, why? It's not just a tradition of party discipline, it's actually built into their voting system because with your second vote in German, your so-called Zweitstimme, you vote for the party and then the party then sends the delegate to the Bundestag. So you see it's kind of baked into the system. I put some more stuff up there, but I think we can move on. This is actually a fun point because these are all things of different order. This is, I would say, a lower order in terms of its feasibility and its implementability, but it's really powerful. All the debates we have in this country about voter registration, it's automatic. When you register in Germany for your residency permit, you are already registered. If you go to prison, you don't lose your right to vote. So a lot of the debates that we're having in this country, state by state, are federally solved across the board, and you have automatically much greater participation. Mail-in voting, all the claims that are basically false, that it's fraudulent, et cetera, not true. Germans have had a great experience. They liberalized that practice in 2006. Now, as you can barely see on the slide, 40% vote that way. They like to do it, and there's no need for you to explain why you're doing it. You don't have to say you're sick or you're traveling or anything. You simply say you want to do it. It's what I would say is a mature democracy, trusting the constituency. Number 5 is kind of interesting, and that's a different order matter that has to do very much with history. It's called in German eine streitbare Demokratie. Defending democracy, as Mark would probably admit, is a little bit of a weak translation. It's more like a fighting, fighting Irish. It's a fighting democracy. It's a democracy that understands, this is interesting, its own vulnerability. Whereas I think in this country, we have only recently come to understand how much democracy depends on everyone's participation, active participation. At least in my lifetime, I kind of grew up thinking, oh, there it is, strong and mighty, a beacon to the world, right? And maybe it was those things, right? But now we're beginning to say, oh my gosh, it can crumble if we don't do something to support it. Germans knew that from the beginning. They knew that because of the Nazi past. They knew that because of the Weimar past, the interwar past. And they knew it because they had groups in the society that were threatening with violence, and they had to be suppressed. And they actively did it with police force. I've given you some of those acronyms. They had spies from East Germany. They had the Communist Party. They had the terrorists, the RAF, the Rote Armee Fraktion, the Red Army faction, etc. The underground, National Socialist Underground, more recently, which was handled deplorably, but nevertheless is an example of the need for a streitbare, a fighting democracy. One other example here to I think illustrate the larger point would be that the current party, the current far-right party, with respect to its policies, by the way, completely analogous to the Republican Party today, okay, is under examination by the Federal Constitutional Office for violating the Constitution. So up there I put down, the FBI in quotation marks because I think that would be the agency in this country that would be analogous. And I incorrectly put the BMI, so please forgive me, you Germany watchers. I don't think it's the Bundesministerium des Inneren. It's a special federal agency that's related to enforcing the Constitution. But after it went to the courts to get approval, because you would need approval, right, to investigate one of your own parties. They found that there was reason to do this, that there is, and they are now currently under investigation, and they may be suffer consequences in court and prison. There are other issues here, including the overrepresentation in Germany and the United States of violent right-wingers. So in the United States, we know that police and those in the armed services were overly represented compared to their presence in the larger population. That's not my judgment. That's a statistical description. Overrepresented among the people in the January 6th insurrection. Something similar is true in Germany. But what's happened in Germany is they've had a much stronger response. They've eliminated whole police units, whole battalions in the army. They've gone after them actively. In the United States, to my knowledge, all we've done, and it's not unimportant, is prosecute individuals. Now, hundreds have been prosecuted. That's good, right? But we haven't particularly gone into these cells in the military and in the police to try to solve that problem. Those are all examples of a fighting democracy that's saying, hey, we have to monitor this. We don't just sit back and wait to see if there are problems. We know there are people threatening. So this is a longer tradition in Germany. All right. Now, I think Szabo may have gotten these things in the wrong order. I probably should have reordered them. The social market economy is a factor of a much grander order because it really embraces a lot of the other things that we're talking about. The social market economy is not a socialist economy. That's an important thing because that word is a fighting word in the American parlance. The social market economy is also very much a result of the interwar structural crises, in other words, massive poverty and inflation that most observers thought led to the rise of Hitler. When people are in great need, they may be more vulnerable to that. So the Allies, after the war, insisted, that's interesting, right? All the Western Allies insisted that Germany institute a social market economy, meaning that all the basic needs of people would be met and that you would not have the extremes in income and wealth gaps that we have in this country. Now, it wasn't just them thinking virtually about the past. They were thinking about the present as well, because they were afraid if this were to happen in Germany, that we had again great inflation or the great disparities in wealth and income, then the Marxists on the other side of the wall, the communists on the other side of the wall would become a more interesting option. So it was a Cold War problem as well. Now, what is the example of a social market economy? I hope you can read your screen better than I can read mine. Universal health care, maternal, paternal, family benefits, Kindergeld, money for children. I have a slide that actually explains this in greater detail. If you can bear with me, it's the next one, I think, yes. I turn to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a group of 38 states that are all dedicated to democracy and free markets. And they have a really interesting measure from 0 to 1, 0 being total equality, complete equality, and 1 being complete inequality. And you can see the way Germany ranks as significantly less unequal, if that's a good way to put it, than the United States. Also, Germany does much better in the poverty gap, as you can see, 39th highest poverty gap in the world for the US, and Germany 144th. And the third factor when we're thinking about the social market economy that ensures social cohesion is the strength and health of trade unions in Germany, which historically have been much stronger. Now, we've seen a rise in the United States. You saw Joe Biden go stand with the UAW. That's interesting. We saw a little bit of stuff happening with Starbucks. That's good. But compared to Germany, it's nothing. In Germany, the trade unionists sit on the boards of trustees of the companies that they work for. They have a role. It's called Mitbestimmung. They decide along with the board. They are not decided for. So that's a huge difference. And by the way, it is not something that is up for debate every election. It's a consensus across the political spectrum, from right to left. The CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, and the CSU, the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, conservative Bavaria, all of them support everything I've talked about. Right? They'll fight about other things, but that's the baseline to which there is already consensus. Okay, number 7, confronting the Nazi past. I wanted to put this one in there because I wanted to stress the connection between commemorating the genocide and democracy. Because I think what we do is we forget. We think we're just being virtuous or being offering ex post facto justice to victims, which is good. It's intrinsically valuable to say, okay, this group was persecuted and murdered, and just to acknowledge it as a human truth, it's a human goodness. What we overlook, though, is that it's always intricately intertwined with democracy. Right? The genocide against the Jews, the Shoah, the process began with their deprivation of civil rights in September 15th, 1935, the first wave of the Nuremberg laws. And Lisa, you know there was more than one because you're a student of Germany as well. But that was the big one, right? So, and once you can take people who are officially citizens, right? And then say, no, you're not. Now you're nationals, right? You can begin the process of legally, within the framework, of depriving them of their property, forcing them out of the country, and in many cases, into suicide and concentration camps. That's a story that can be told elsewhere, but I wanted to stress the nexus between memory and democracy, because when we talk about taking a lesson from German memory culture and applying it to racism in this country, we're also talking about inculcating memory. Inculcating democracy, right? Because if we're going to remember lynchings, if we're going to remember all the injustices of the apartheid in the South, right? We have to then also remember why that was instituted, right? To keep blacks from voting. Right? So democracy and memory are related. That's the perhaps too quick point here. I wanted to give two examples. I spoke earlier about the way in which, the German democracy is an active fighting democracy, but it's not just in words, and it's not just in police action or court action. It's also in a really rich social way. And I've given two examples here. I'm already worried about failing because to do a good job, I should give you radio examples and other kinds of concrete things where you could just enjoy the richness of these two entities. But let me do my best. The BPB, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, something that Mark and I use in our teaching quite a bit, and others as well. The federal unit or the federal place for political education. When I first encountered this in Germany when I was your ages, I thought, oh, how sad. The Germans need a propaganda agency to teach them about democracy. These poor guys, they're still so contaminated by Nazism, they just don't get it. But we don't need this in America. This would never fly in America. And by the way, I don't think it would. I think people would, think, oh, we have democracy in our blood. It's corn-fed Americans. We know what democracy is, like Thomas Mann said. Although he was being nice, right? The truth of this, though, is that this is an amazing agency that provides educational materials, digital, print, all kinds, not only for Germans, but also abroad. So it's very much involved in Germany's reputation outside of the country, but also very much alive within. If you care about voting trends or results, right, you go to this website. And you get valuable stuff immediately. In the United States, where do you go? You're trying to track an election? We do have options. News media, right? And then you don't know how long that's going to be left up. You don't know how it's going to compare. Some of them will do better. But really, private, for-profit news media, we're dependent upon them. This is not. This is state-funded. It's independent. Right? League of Women Voters, good when you can get it, but not nearly as rich as this, right? So this is important. The second one is, I think, even more important. It is a really rich offering of public and television, radio, and public television. Now, if you think of the American options, at least what we have, there's some pretty sad shows. They're raising money all the time and telling you, just really not rich stuff. In Germany, it's a cornucopia. And it goes back to the idea that the airwaves are owned by the people, and it goes back to the fundamental, and it's anchored in the Constitution and in law, right? The airwaves are not to be sold. They are fundamentally the property of the people. Now, this was qualified, and there are private broadcasters in significant measure. Now, I don't want to deny that at all, but there are still significant amounts of radio and TV in the public sector. And they have kid shows that are so popular that adults watch them. They have debates at night that I race home from events to attend to because you learn so much. They're high level, they're sophisticated. It's frankly nothing like what we have here. Again, if I were to really convince you, I would show you that. That would be a separate lecture, and maybe we'll come back and do that. I don't know. But I wanted to give you the sense, this is like what Dewey meant about a culture of democracy. It's not just voting, which is crucial. Right? That's what kind of the end product of democracy. It's everything that goes into it, informing yourself. Remember when the news anchor played by, at the beginning, Jeff Daniels, of course, who we saw live on Broadway, says at the end, it's all about being informed, right? Well, Germany does a whole lot to inform its population. I think we could possibly do that as well. I promise not to go into this because I know that we need to conclude soon, but Benjamin and I spoke before, and we talked about another lesson that doesn't come from post-war Germany, but comes from pre-Nazi Germany. That is the Weimar period. And that was a big deal because when Trump was president and when he lost the election but claimed he didn't, right, a number of scholars began to write about this. And they were beginning, even before the election and the insurrection and all that, scholars like Christopher Browning were beginning to wonder, like, what is going on here with this Trump presidency? It begins to feel like fascism. Now, he used language much more careful than the word I just used, but it's in the New York Review of Books. I've given you all the authors. It's well worth looking at. I taught this in a class, in an integration course here at the undergraduate level called Confronting Racism, Authoritarianism, and Anti-Democratic Forces, Lessons from Russia, Germany, and Eastern Europe. And when the course, we had no idea that the insurrection was going to happen. It was already on the books. The insurrection happens, and then we realize we have to talk about this lesson from Weimar because all these scholars are talking about the way in which the United States looks like Germany before Hitler. Now, none of these renowned scholars, most of them from Yale, Chris Browning from UNC, Sam Moyn is from Yale, and I think Timothy and Jason are both from Yale. None of them are making cheap equivalencies. They're making really interesting arguments. Sam Moyn, for example, doesn't even like the idea of the analogy, but not for what you think. For him, it's worse. I'm not going to go into it because that would really throw us off a bit. But I wanted to suggest, if only briefly, that we have lessons not only from post-war Germany, but also from pre-war Germany. Before I have you read this quote, or before I read it to you, I thought I would take a pause, take a breath, and put a little space between all the various things that I've suggested that we might or might not borrow or adapt, and then between this, right? Because I feel that the talk thus far could seem a little, I don't know, boutique, a little quaint, like, oh, how can we spiff up our democracy and make it a little bit easier? But friends, I don't think we're in that state, right? If what Heather Cox Richardson says here is true, and by the way, she's echoing what many other people have said on the left and the right. David Brooks, a conservative commentator, has said something very similar. If she's right about the urgency and the crisis of democracy in this country, I'm not sure we have time to worry about Sunday voting, right? This is something much graver. So let's take a look at that. I'll read it as best I can. She's referring to this CPAC meeting that just occurred and that Trump attended, as I'm sure you know if you watched. And the speaker says, "Welcome to the end of democracy. We are here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it and replace it with this right here." He held up a cross necklace and continued, Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, by the way, which is the epitome of exceptionalism that we talked about at the very beginning. So he holds up the cross and says, "After we burn that swamp to the ground, we will establish the new American Republic on its ashes, and our first order of business will be righteous retribution for those who betrayed America." Now you could say, okay, he's a crazy nut, right? Except that this was attended by and applauded by all kinds of people that are much more familiar to you. And then she concludes with this sentence, now referring to the most recent scandal in Alabama, the vitro fertilization story. I'll only pay attention to the last sentence for the purpose of my talk. It is simply a different facet of a larger story. The leaders of the Republican Party are working to overthrow democracy. Now, I want to say for the record, Heather Cox Richardson is definitely aligned with the Democrats. However, You can get similar sentiments, as I said earlier, from David Brooks. It's kind of surprised me, and others. When mainstream people, she's a professor at Boston College, a professor of history focusing on the 19th century. When mainstream people are telling you this, right, then you have to, I think, seriously consider where we are. Are we in a mood where do we have the luxury to say, oh, that looks interesting, I want to adopt that little thing that Germany's doing? Or are we at a space where we have to say, yes, let's try to make things better, but maybe we need to do something more, like get out on the streets, or I don't know. I'd like to have that conversation with you. The question that I also have is, what can this university do better? One of the things that I told you earlier in this talk was that money, that Germans have largely succeeded in keeping money, at least to the extent that we have it sloshing around in our country, out of elections, and it's been a good thing, right? I don't have any illusions that a small Midwest university can save American democracy, right? And I applaud Provost McGreevy's initiative on democracy, of which I think this is a part, so I'm grateful for all that. But if we want to make some connections and do something, could we not insist or push for this university not to take money from anybody who denies the election, not to take money from any party that is lying about democracy or undermining democracy demonstrably, right? I'm not talking about, insinuations or anything, but to really take a stand. I raised this question. We could also talk about the Supreme Court and this university's relationship to the Supreme Court, if you wish. But that would more or less conclude. I have, as you know, many more slides. I'm not going to go through them all, but there are things that are happening in Germany that we could talk about and I could illustrate that are really encouraging. For example, the German Catholic Church, unlike the Council of Bishops in the United States, has come out decisively and condemned the right-wing party, the AfD. Where is that happening in this country, and why is it not happening? Right? This is civil society at work. It's a healthy civil society. Now, if you know Germany, you may come back and say, why are you so blue-eyed? That's what the Germans say. You're so naive about Germany. There are problems. The current government is in crisis. They have a budget crisis. You can go right down the list. It is not a Shangri-La, right? But their democracy is better. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me? All right, okay, great. Thank you, that was a very informative talk. Just to make sure that we have enough time for audience questions, I'm gonna limit myself to just 2 questions for a brief moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience for you all to be able to engage with Professor Donahue. So there was a lot of questions that I had, but I'm gonna focus on 2. So the first one is, I don't know if you guys were able to go to the Democracy Forum event last semester with Stephen Levitsky. Raise your hand if you were, just so I know. Okay, so not that, okay. So the premise of what he was saying was that a large amount of the efforts to undermine American democracy and what he calls the tyranny of the minority is sort of rooted in a backlash to us transitioning to becoming a multiracial democracy with full suffrage. That was sort of the gist of what he's saying. And the reason that I bring that up is I was going to talk about AfD and what the German response to AfD has been. So I'm not super familiar with German history, but I know that Germany, like other countries in Europe, have experienced large amounts of refugees coming in from the Middle East and other places, and that this has provoked in part backlash from right-wing parties such as AfD, if I'm not mistaken. That's not too dissimilar from something we've seen in the United States as well. Where are the differences in how Germany has been dealing with AfD and in trying to maybe its own transition to a pluralistic society, including people of different ethnic backgrounds, versus how the United States has dealt with that?
Thank you, and please keep me on track. I'm looking over to Catherine because she's an expert on this as well. She's in the refugee studies class. We're going to Germany, to Berlin, in just next week to study precisely these questions. You may want to know that when Angela Merkel, the then chancellor, admitted over 1 million refugees in 2015, 2016, in the wake of the Syrian civil war, She said, "Es gibt keine Alternative. We have to do this. There is no alternative." And this party very cleverly said, "Oh yeah, there's an alternative, and we're founding it right now. The alternative for Germany." So you have to give them, in terms of rhetoric, that was very clever. This party began as a Eurosceptic party, and then when the refugees started coming in great numbers, they became primarily an anti-immigration and anti-refugee party. They have always been kind of a coalition of different groups, including neo-Nazis, but not only, right? So one has to be differential, as one does in this country as well. I welcome people across the spectrum until they no longer support democracy. That's, for me, the litmus test on either side, but right now we're experiencing it on the Republican side. So what has Germany done? For one, I think if I had people to really push me here, they say they're worried that, yes, they've taken measures, but we're still concerned. The Alternative für Deutschland, the right-wing anti-immigrant party, is strongest in the east of Germany, the former East Germany, that is the least populated part, and interestingly, the part of the country with the least number of refugees. Yeah, so it's about fear. And there's other complications there. So, but you asked, Benjamin, what are they doing to ameliorate or to make it more popular? For one, Germany has pumped in billions of euros. I think the most recent budget is 6 billion. One estimate a couple of years ago was 30 million per refugee, but not that they received it, but it was, if you include all the money for infrastructure. So lots of money for teaching and for enculturation. Our daughter is a teacher in one of the refugee schools, the Jesuit school, the Catholic Jesuit school in Berlin. It actually got special licensure from the Senate in Berlin to open up a special branch just to serve these students. I'm not telling you some kind of unrepresentative story, because this task was given to schools throughout the country. I am particularly proud of this Jesuit school, though, because they went the extra mile and welcomed the students. They didn't simply say, "Oh, okay, we'll do it," and then went out and got the special license and extra money. And they hired our daughter, which we're very happy about. But that much aside, these are real benefits. So they get, you get health care until your case has been decided. You get minimal health care. And once your case has been decided positively, you get the full health care that any citizen would get in Germany. You get, if you're Ukrainian right now, you get between 300 and 400 euros a month. That's a little bit of a different story because, frankly, Ukrainians are more welcome than dark-skinned Muslims for reasons of racism, right? That's kind of what's going on. But I don't want to stand here and tell you, oh, they've solved it, right? They would never say that themselves. Even the school where my daughter works is very humble about it. They say, well, we've got some good things going here. We can show you that they're learning German. We can show you that they're entering apprentice programs. I guess one figure that you might want to hold on to is from that early wave, 2015 to 2016, 50% are either in apprentice programs or they're working. Now, are they working at the same job they had before? Not necessarily, because there's a very complicated process of getting your credentials acknowledged and accepted. But they're working, which is kind of a big deal. So that's a big success rate. And if you adjust that for children who can't be working yet, it looks even better. Is that detailed enough?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Yeah, and then for my second question before I hand it off to the audience. So you were going through, as I'm a political science student, and so I'm interested in sort of the policy aspect of it. You were going through the different agencies, and you mentioned one, I can't pronounce that, I don't speak German, but the one that's sort of in charge of enforcing the German Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
What was the name of the...
Oh, Mark, maybe you can help me. It's the federal...
When you said misnamed, it's
Yeah.
the German equivalent of the FBI. I suspect you didn't actually have the answer.
Right, it's the Federal Constitutional Enforcement. I'll have to send it to you.
There's an agency that does
Yes.
this, right? Okay. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in, because it I think maybe you would agree with this, is sort of the sense in the United States that even our most basic institutions seem to have become, or at least perceived to be, politicized. What's the case like in Germany? Are these you mentioned that there's a consensus around democracy.
Yeah.
Are these institutions that enforce the Constitution, protect democracy? Is that what do the Germans do to prevent that from being seen at, or being controlled in a partisan way, or being seen to be politically motivated?
So that's good. That reminds me also that I didn't fully answer the first part. So one other crucial way that Germany is dealing with the AfD, the AfD, is that no major party has agreed to go into coalition with them. So they have marginalized them and kept them out. They are at about 10% of the seats in the Bundestag. They have risen in recent times, but they've also sunk. People are watching it very, very nervously. But the way in which this functions is, so once, except for one problem, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, flirted in a local election with a coalition, but they suffered immediately for doing that. So there's a strong social sense of don't you dare go down that road. That's Nazism. Now, it was a court decision that allowed their equivalent of maybe what we would call the Department of Justice to investigate. So it wasn't controlled by the parties, as I think gets to your point. Yeah. So the court said, yes, you presented enough evidence, enough prima facie evidence to convince us that they are violating the Constitution. You go full hog now and do a real investigation. And they didn't have to get that approved by the Bundestag. So I think that evaded some of these political pressures.
Great. Well, I'm going to open it up for the audience now. If you could just raise your hand, and when I call on you, then Claudio or Dr. Francis will be able to bring the microphone over to you. Any questions? Okay, we'll start here and then.
Although you had mentioned The Tyranny of the Minority, which is a recent book that came out, and one of the ways they were saying to defend democracy was, the active defense, like the BMI or their FBI. But the other recommendation they had, temporary recommendations, was a coalition in government. And I guess what I'm saying is, if this is in fact an emergency, because it is an election, why or do we have any hope that the conservative, non-radicalized parts of the Republican Party are going to say that, well, you know what, we need to, and right now they seem to be voting, well, there are some exceptions, of course, Cheney but generally these conservative elements still exist in the Republican Party. And, is there hope? Because I think right now we need coalition government might be the best rescue in an emergency, because if they're just going to go party line, to me, that's dangerous. So I'm just, your opinion on whether they step up in an emergency.
I wish I had a crystal ball, and I think we share the same hope. Like anyone else who reads the newspapers, we hope they break ranks and vote their conscience, and that there's something of the old conservatism, those values that would somehow resuscitate. Because, as you say, Mitt Romney did a virtuous thing at least once, maybe twice. Liz Cheney, is it Adam Kitzinger? I mean, we can find them, but we have to look closely, and they don't seem to be in enough numbers. Coalition building doesn't quite work in the American Congress, but you could have an informal one where they break ranks and vote with the other party. I completely share your sentiments and your hopes.
And then, Patrick.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. I think that is amazing to think that the student becomes the teacher when it comes to democracy, and this fascinating comparison. So after listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the Electoral College of this constitutional body that oversees the enactment of the Constitution. So my problem is that every time, and also I want to link this with the Levitsky conference, every time that I think about, reducing the time period of the Supreme Court justices or abolishing the Electoral College, I think that those are very difficult things to do, because that means that the political parties will have less power. So I would like to bring the conversation, and I would like to hear your thoughts on more concrete technical measures that could be done at the local level in which we can strengthen democracy. And I was thinking, for instance, I had the opportunity to be electoral observer in Georgia in the last presidential election. And I was really struck by the fact that the current governor used to be the Secretary of State, and he was in charge of organizing the elections because the Secretary of States across the country are the persons in charge of organizing the election, and he was also running for governor. So this is something that the US will say in any democratic country in the world that it's unfair, it's less transparent, it's not very autonomous. So what about like trying to push for creating electoral commissions at the local level where non-partisan people can oversee and organize the whole process? And then I think that there are 2 or 3 states that have that. And then people that are not aligned with the political parties can say who won the election or something like that. I would like to hear your thoughts on more realistic measures probably in a short period of time that we can do to follow this path instead of trying to reform the Constitution, which is going to be a more unlikely process to see in the US.
Well, I think what you just said is as valuable as anything I could say. But let's take some hope from the fact that, in the United States, federal elections are controlled by the states. So we do have the local power to change it. And the suggestion you make is entirely viable. I mean, we do have some examples of gerrymandering being addressed. Not enough. It should be more widely spread, but there are some beginnings. I do also want to go back to the beginning of your question, though, because I do agree with you. It sounds daunting to change the Constitution, but I like to remind audiences that we've done it before. Some people think, for example, that the Second Amendment is holy. How many of you think it's holy? We used to have a colleague here, Comers, Don Comers. Is he still with us? No. Yeah. So he was a real expert on the constitutions, but he referred to the American Constitution as sacral. But it was an intellectual descriptive way of contrasting it to the German Constitution. But no amendment is sacred. Right? We had prohibition, and we took it away. It came in through an amendment, and it was taken away through an amendment within about 13 years, right, between the 2 amendments. Amendments can be amended, people. And the ERA failed by 1 vote, 1 state. We could revive that. So I simply want to go back to your premise and maybe inject some hope in that. And maybe that's also what we do, not just talk at universities, but get out there and try to do something. But I love your suggestion about local work. And that's what Maria always tells me we need to do is get out there and do local elections and run, right? We have some colleagues who are running and frankly, very unlikely races for them to win, but they're getting out there. So thank you for your contribution.
Other questions?
Bill, I was going to ask a similar question. If you could distinguish between structural changes that would be very difficult and changes that can be done. And I think your gerrymandering example is excellent. It changed Michigan's electoral landscape dramatically. Ranked choice voting would be another. But since I have the microphone, I want to first compliment it with an I. I learned a lot from your presentation, and now compliment it with an E, because there's one other dimension of the American political landscape that rankles me quite a bit, and it's from a German perspective that I'm critical of it. And that is this discussion that applying Article 14, Paragraph 3 to Trump would be anti-democratic. And the reason why I think it's absurd is that the structure of democracy is majority rule. Under the structure of democracy, in principle, it would be possible for the majority to decide to take away minority rights, which is exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic. A 2/3 majority erased the basic rights of the Constitution. And the current German Constitution not only has a clause that says if the party is anti-democratic, they are outlawed, which happened with the Communist Party early after World War II, but it has a clause, Article 79, Paragraph 3, which understands the self-canceling structure of democracy unless it has a higher category or concept that ensures it. Article 1 ensures the dignity of the human being and basic human rights. Article 20 protects the social state and the structure of democracy. Well, Article 79, Paragraph 3 says, under no circumstances can Articles 1 and 20 be eliminated. In other words, it is an anti-democratic structure which recognizes the transcendental value of democracy and basic human rights, especially human dignity, influenced by the Catholic social teaching, so that democracy is protected. But we're saying democracy is just letting people do what they want, which can lead to the destruction of democracy. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to pursue at least that argument.
Right. Before we go on, I won't take too long, but Mark was kind enough to speak to my students in the course I mentioned earlier, Confronting Racism, Authoritarianism, and Anti-Democratic Forces. And one of the things that I wanted a lesson from Germany was the way in which Germans dealt with abortion. Abortion, the big topic at Notre Dame that is, oh, can we talk about it? Can we talk about it? Well, Germany talked about it, right? And the Supreme Court ruled on it and then threw it to the Parliament. But I was so glad you were coming today because I thought, we might actually go there. That's a fascinating story. I didn't dare to tell it, although I was thinking of stealing your slides. I still have them. But it's yet another lesson about how we can actually achieve a value of reducing abortion, which, by the way, does not achieve by making it illegal. We know that. Well, at least we should know that. Right? Anyway, so thank you for that remark and also for your prior work.
Hi. Thank you very much for this presentation. I have a question about the AfD. You had mentioned it's around 10% of the electorate in Germany, and that it's very strong in the East, the former German Democratic Republic. And initially, it seemed like the immigration issue was really strong. In the eastern part of Germany, there's a lot of economic issues. But I think there's also growth, though, taking place in other parts of Germany, too. So I wanted to get your assessment of what other factors are driving the growth of the AfD while recognizing that they are going up and down. And there have been some really strong protests against the AfD and with demonstration in other cities.
Oh, yes.
And then the other thing real quickly is, we don't see the growth of right-wing extremism just in Germany, in other European countries too. So is there any common thread that you can see between the growth of the AfD in Germany and some of the other European countries too?
That's a very ambitious question. I wish we still had Cas Muda here. Cas Muda is the world expert on populism, and he actually was a professor here, or at least he had a fellowship there. I'll try to sum of that, but I'm so glad you brought up that. First of all, my 10% number is low. Recently, it's gone up and then dipped a bit, so we're hovering more closer to 20, which is worrying people. And it's also pulling the right-wing parties, the CDU and the CSU, over. They're trying to find ways. Can we somehow lure those voters? Can we appeal to them? Can we be a little bigoted? Can we, be a little anti-immigrant? They want to see how far they can go without being anti-democratic. Friedrich Merz is doing this in a way that is kind of difficult and maybe despicable. But I'm really happy that you brought up the protest movements. I meant to talk about the rich protest structure. Now, I don't, or protest fabric in Germany. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets in the last 3 weeks. And this is just this weekend. I just pulled it off of one of the big newspapers. And that's no, that's not what I want. No, sorry, we're going the wrong way. Oh, dear. Okay. I've lost it now. Okay. Oh, you know what? There we go. There it is, 10,000 just last week. And then we have the numbers of cities that are listed here, Dresden, Stuttgart, and then smaller numbers in 3 or 4 other towns. I guess it's not worth go, but I did want to simply honor that point that this is a lively, committed culture. Right? This is, I guess, the contrast I'm feeling between sitting in a room, which is good and proper. I'm a teacher. I believe in the Enlightenment and in education, but it's not enough, right? I think I feel there's a self-critique as well that maybe we need to join these. Maybe we have to have these as well. I do think that these are having an effect. I think that they are keeping the AfD to some extent marginalized. And then another remark that doesn't answer or solve the problem, but I wanted just to throw it out there. I don't like using the word causality. Because, the whole logical problem of, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Just because it happens after, it doesn't mean it was caused by the prior unit, right? Although we often assume it's the case. So you have influx of refugees, and then you have the increased popularity of the right-wing party. You say, well, that caused that. That's not entirely wrong, except that I always try this experiment, and I tried it in your class too. When you think about the great migration from the American South, and you see the great numbers of blacks moving north, and then we have gradually a rise in anti-black racism. Are we really prepared to say that blacks caused the racism? I hope not entirely. I hope you're a little uncomfortable with that, right? So let's also think that there were prior sentiments, there were prior ways of thinking and bigotry that already existed. Now, it's a complicated thing, and I don't have the instrument to test this out, but I just want to be careful because so quickly in the media we get these reports that, oh yes, they caused that, and if we just stop it, the party will go away. That's all the wisdom I think I really have, but you've asked such a rich question.
Thank you all very much. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, but I'm not sure if you have any time to stick around after. I don't know. We have some refreshments in the back. If you could please go ahead and help yourself to that. And I believe we have some shirts for Anti-Democracy Talks there as well, if you'd like to grab one. Traditionally, we always end the Democracy Talks by asking our guest speaker any advice that they have for students, faculty, or guests who would like to be a champion of democracy. And I guess I'm going to rephrase the question a little bit today. Based off your experience and what you've seen in maybe German universities, what can we at the University of Notre Dame learn from German universities to become champions of democracy as well?
It's a very good question. I had the privilege of teaching at a university in the Ruhrgebiet last year, and the students were very, very, they were very good students. They were also, it's a whole different experience from Notre Dame. Notre Dame students, we live in a paradise and very grateful for it. No matter where we come from, we're privileged to be here. They were, however, working students. And I couldn't even we couldn't have this, for example, there. We couldn't have a meeting after classes. They arrived, they had their jobs, they had children in many cases, and they went home. So I'm going to have to disappoint you. I don't have any example there. If you go to a wealthier university in the South that Mark might know, the LMU, that's a different story entirely. And there we could probably look at the activism and take an example from that.
All right, thank you all very much for coming today. Like I said, please help yourself for refreshments, and let's give it a hand for
Thank you. Thanks.